Hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. So our panel will be, in a way, like continuation of our previous discussion, but we will be focusing on people in Russia who still have enough bravery to actually show their protest. And yeah, of course, we all know that the question of if Russian society supports the war, supports Putin or not, is a question that is fiercely debated wherever it is raised and whenever it is raised. On our panel, we will talk about Russians who disagree with the war and other brutal actions of Russian government. And our distinguished speakers today are Mikhail Thumann, is it correct? Foreign Affairs Correspondent and Moscow Bureau Chief of Zeit, one of the biggest German media outlets. Alexandra Arkhipova, sociologist, associated fellow at the Center of Russian, Caucasian, and Central European Studies in Paris. Alexandra Arkhipova, social anthropologist and visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure. And Lyuba Zakharov, feminist and queer activist, member of the Feminist Anti-War Resistance and Feminist Anti-War Resistance Cell in Hamburg. So, yeah, I know I'll state obvious in a way by saying that the level of repression in Russia has been steadily increasing. All of the independent politicians, activists, journalists were pushed out of the country. But however, in 2024, this year, many people in Russia, and there were events when we saw many people in Russia actually showing up. I only can call these events historical, and I'm sure that they will be remembered in our common history. They actually showed up, and I think they deserve to be discussed in a separate panel. What events I'm talking about, and all these events were marked by queues and lines, which are, yeah, the word is in our panel's name. So we saw the queues of people who wanted to sign for the only anti-war candidate on so-called presidential elections. We saw queues to monuments of victims of political repression to honor the memory of Alexei Navalny. We saw mourning lines to bid farewell to him. Yeah, and it seems like this year these people were more visible. And I'll begin our conversation with a question to all of our speakers. What is your perception of these lines, of these queues? Do you think that this is actually a protest, or is it something else? Who wants to start? Mikhail, maybe you.
Yeah, well, I think actually it is protests, and what is amazing is maybe I should start with numbers, which make that protest very visible. Let me just, yeah, here I have it. It's the OVD info data about people detained, which I think is an indicator and tells us where we stand 2.5 years after Russia's attack on Ukraine. So in 2022, we had close to 20,000 detained people during anti-war protests. In 2023, the number was down to 381, according to OVD info. And well, in this year, only in the first half of the year, we have already more than 1,140. So numbers actually of detainees go up, and this shows us that there have been considerably more protests and manifestations this year than the year before. And of course, as you said, this is closely linked to the events we had in this year. But I would not, for example, put the funeral of Alexei Navalny. This was not just an anti-war manifestation. It was much more than that and something different than that also. Well, maybe we come to that later. But in general, I think that the protests, unlike the regime might have wished for, protests have not died out. Although we see them on a minimal scale, and reasons for that are ample. We also, I think, should touch upon that, and it had been touched upon in the last panel. But it's still there, and the regime finds no measure to quell them entirely. And that is, I think, what is amazing we should talk about.
Yeah, maybe somebody wants to continue before I turn to individual questions.
I would say that it is a protest, and it was a protest, even though participants did not wish, in many cases, to call it protest. And I'd like to put it in the context, saying that quite often international media, and also in some extent Russian media, have a tendency to call protest only expression in public space, and especially in urban place. And this is the main focus. So when there are no rallies with protest slogans, so it's considered like Russia is completely quiet. But there are other places where the protest and resistance not only possible, but continue and go on throughout this almost 3 years of war. And those are, for example, the transport and energy infrastructure, which is kind of insane if we think out about that. But sabotage counts dozens of cases per month, which means that there is a protest which is not outspoken, besides maybe Ilya Ponomarev, who pretends he blown out every second train in Russia. But except this fact, normally it's not connected with the discursive expression. So it's kind of invisible protest, even if it's very expressive, just like blowing a train or an industrial facility which produces armaments. Then there is community building, which is a form of resistance, and it's almost invisible, and it's extremely important if we speak about the opposition to the authoritarian pressure, right? And then there is also something which is almost completely forgotten. This is the resistance on the working place. And it's mostly focused on cultural initiatives and cultural production. And in case, for example, of school teachers or journalists, we may investigate and we may look in a granular level how it works.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, this slow, quiet protest, and I think we'll come to that a bit later. Mikhail, I want to return to you because you were a witness, a lucky witness and brave witness, of course, because you go to Russia to cover the events that are going on inside the country. I personally, as a journalist, Russian journalist in exile, I am very jealous of you because I cannot go to Russia. Can you please tell us a bit more about those events that you saw, that you witnessed, the election campaign, the farewell to Alexei Navalny? Tell us about these people. Who were they, and what is your perception of this event as a rare witness?
Well, it was February, and actually the electoral campaign and the death, the murder of Alexei Navalny coincided. And I think this made the whole events especially tense. And I think it required, in the first place, when the news broke in mid-February, it required very special courage, actually, to go out, to walk out, And there were two areas in the Moscow center where actually you had, I wouldn't call that protest, but it was just, you know, it was a pre-funeral event. It was expressing grief on the one hand, disbelief, shock, horror, and rejection of the regime. And the people who gathered there those were not just intellectuals or not just young people or old. It were really from all walks of life. You could, for the first time, you could see since a long time in Moscow, again, many people gathering for a certain purpose in the center of the city. So students and pensioners and teachers and pupils and salesperson and from all walks of life. What I think was very different between the two events, and the second event was then widely, I think, of the funeral was shown all over the world. And the big difference between the two events was that the events in Moscow were much more tense. There were just loads of police, brigades of police, plus you had all the cameras and you had all the infrastructure the Russian authorities have in the city center of Moscow. So they could use that perfectly, of course, to film, to photograph everybody. And everybody knew that. So people were actually cautious, very cautious, but they went nevertheless with their flowers in their hands and laid the flowers down at the two monuments, the Solovyetsky stone and the repression monument at Prospekt Zakharova. But I'd say they were so cautious because they felt they were powerless and the authorities, the police, could do with them at any time what they wanted to do. And this was very much different at the funeral because the crowds were so big that the authorities themselves were overwhelmed and apparently decided, okay, we let that happen. We know it's going to go away, and but we'll allow it to happen. And you had, of course, also you had detainments there, but it was on a very limited scale. So this was probably the last huge manifestation of protest and grief in Russia for a long time. And there was an underlying mood. I would say it was on the one hand, it was the mourning. It was the shock and horror that Navalny was murdered, and there was a second very important element, which was it was waving goodbye to an alternative, and to the only man who was really able to challenge Putin in ways that you could see into Putin's eyes, how he reacted to that. Navalny was the only one who managed to do so. And it was waving goodbye to this alternative and also to a certain, to a future for the time being, for a future beyond Putin.
Thank you, Mikhail. That's fascinating. I mean, it's very appreciate your impressions. You mentioned flowers. And this is the moment when I want to turn to Alexandra. There are not only lines, but oftentimes people come with flowers to those lines. And many people in this room probably know that one of the famous flower memorials in Russia is the memorial to Boris Nemtsov. And here I would like to mention another horrific act of repression that happened a couple of days ago. The Nemtsov Bridge volunteer Evgeny Mishenko was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He was accused of participating in terror activity based on text messages. And this text messages exchange was most probably provoked by FSB. But yeah, returning to our subject, the flower protest, Alexander, is it correct to assume that it began with the memorial at the site of Boris Nemtsov's murder, And what is happening with this memorial today? And can you also tell us a bit more about, you made this lovely, beautiful flower protest map. Can you tell us a bit about where do these memorials happen?
Yes, of course. Can I show my slides, please? Okay. So I would like to start my very short remark, not with Russia situation, but with China. And from the experiment which was designed, it's a survey experiment that was designed several years ago, and almost 900 Chinese users of internet was questioned what they think about Chinese government, China, possibility of Chinese protests, and if they could protest. In these surveys, even American scholars even use this euphemism, big walk. Like we used to say in Russia, большая прогулка, because we're not allowed to say that I'm going to participate in rally. So then these users were divided in 5 groups, and 4 of these groups, they received a huge propaganda treatment. Just imagine you are sitting in a small isolated room and you're forced to watch Solovyov, Chinese version of Solovyov, for 4 hours. Or, I don't know, another group was watching several speeches by Vladimir Putin. Another group was watching, I don't know, Margarita Simonyan, something like that. And the last group was drinking tea. So after that, all these groups were questioned again. Are you ready to participate in protest? What do you think about Chinese government? Blah, 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 blah. So their opinion about the politics and in general about the possibility of the protest was almost the same. But their the level of their readiness to participate became quite low, because after this huge propaganda treatment, after they watch, I don't know, Solovyov several hours, they say, well, I think that maybe I could participate in protest because I'm very brave, you know. I can do it any moment. But all the other people, they just want to lie down, watch TV. So it means that these people around me, they never ever will participate in something illegal. It means that why I should do it alone? So after, in the end, we should say that after huge propaganda treatment, people who think differently, who are potential protesters, they feel themselves being loners. They feel that everybody around them is not ready to stand up and fight against the government. So that's what, in reality, the propaganda is doing. They made the people weak and loners, and being lonely. So that's why nowadays in Russia, Russian government is fighting. Can I have another slide? Is fighting any visible elements of protest. I made a special stress on visible, because nowadays in Russia, a lot of people are trying to create these small signs of, I call it semiotic protest, when, I don't know, you have a very, very small image of Ukrainian flag somewhere on your body, literally, so nobody except your family can see it. But it's a sign for yourself, because you're showing yourself that you're not supporting the war. But Russian government is strictly against any visible signs of protest. So nowadays we have only two forms of visible visible protest, is so-called lines and grassroots movement flower protest. For example, it started flower protest. It's kind of commemoration protest when people are bringing flowers, toys, whatever, at the places which somehow are connected to those whom people want to be commemorated. It started in Russia very late in comparison to other countries, because in January this new type of ritual appeared in 70s, in 1970s, so like, I don't know, 50 years ago. But in Russia, it came rather late, and the first bigger event was the death of Boris Nemtsov. After his murder, a lot of memorial places appeared, and then it was a huge fire in 2018, and after that, every big event brings such type of commemorative practice. For example, in 2023, after huge bomb killing in Dnipro, Ukrainian city, people start to bring flowers and to create these spontaneous shrines almost everywhere, basically around memorials dedicated to the memory of political victims. And here you can see the map of these memorials, and the Russian government, Russian task forces, they were trying to prosecute it as much as possible. So they were trying to stop you, to punish you. They were taking your passport number. They were detain you, and so on and so on and so on. And later on, people were putting flowers near Ukrainian memorials, but mostly about political repression memorials. And even sometimes the people create the spontaneous shrines. I called it in a place without a place. Just in the middle of nothing. You can see in the pictures, it's a middle of nothing. You can put flower and everybody knows that somebody thinks the same as you. This is the point. This is the main idea. You cannot be visible to this authority because all the versions of the collective form of protest will be stopped immediately. So in this case, you cannot show yourself, but you can show your object, something like flower, and this flower is lying down in the place without a place, in the middle of nothing. And people who are passing by, they stop and they think, oh yes, this flower is here not because just without a reason. It's because somebody was killed yesterday in Ukraine, or such flowers appeared everywhere because of the death of Alexei Navalny. So the last slide, sorry. So, and another way to be visible is to create a line queue. So there is, if there are any possibility to make this line, there will be line. So this, the last form of protest appeared in any possible moment. So you can see the picture and you can see the number of cities, the top 15 Russian cities, but the number of spontaneous flower memorials. You can see like Petersburg and Moscow, yes, but Ekaterinburg, Chelyabinsk and Cheboksary are the champions. There are plenty of spontaneous shrines dedicated to the death of Alexei Navalny. They were illegal, people were detained for making them, but they appeared again and again, and many of them appeared just in the space, without a space. So people should see and they should remember about this death almost everywhere. So this is like the two main visible forms of Russian protest for now.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. This is a truly fascinating data. Now I want to turn to Lyuba Zakharov, member of Feminist Anti-War Resistance. As Alexandra mentioned, there are obviously not a lot of options for protests in Russia. Can you tell us a bit about what is your assessment of current level of repression? And are there any opportunities actually for activism or protest left?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for this panel and for framing of this discussion, because I think it is so vital to talk about that there is not only one form of protest available to people. That's why I'm very thankful that I can join the discussion today. And I wanted to start with talking about repressions that are currently in Russia. And I think many things have already been said, but I want to focus on like small things, or like big things, but like small points, which is there was more than 200 cases or like protocols on undesirable organization in Russia. I'm not even talking about like foreign agents, because naming of foreign agents, I think even Russian government is already tired of it. They want to do something else, something more extreme. In 22, the bill to expand the ban on LGBT people was passed in Russia, and then the Extreme Court has decided that the so-called international movement, which is apparently going to Russia from Europe, which is interesting, but still. So these LGBT extremists from Europe, they are currently a threat to Russian society, which is rather interesting. And more or less, 55 regional ethnic decolonial movements were called as separatist movements, which are also a threat to Russian society. And if you remember last year, the Russian government were very focused on saving the children from gender-neutral toilets. That was a really big focus of discussion. This year, they're really afraid of quad robbers, which is also something really strange. The women's rights is under pressure because so-called child-free movement, which apparently is also stems from Europe, is also a threat to Russia. This is all just to underline the main idea that the focus is to say that any kind of independent thought, any kind of expression of self is under attack, firstly, and secondly, it is risky. Not only to engage in it yourself, but also to associate with the organization or the person who decided to do so. As a part of feminist anti-war resistance, we were called undesirable organization, and we are feminists, which is already a big no-no for Russian government. Secondly, many of us are queer, which is really, really strange for Russian government. And lastly, probably we all want to make Russian children quad robbers. That's why like Russian population is really afraid, could be really afraid, according to what Russian government says. But jokes aside, I think this marker, even for people who understand the reality, is still very scary, because associating with people who are not located under stress, who do not always perceive the level of repression that are being on your side, it can be really scary. That's why these repressions are not only to put your body into harm, but also to put your mind into thinking that, first of all, I'm alone. Second of all, associating with anyone is risky and you should avoid it. And there is no way out. No one outside cares about what you think. That's why I think it is so remarkable that we saw such amazing form of protest, like, for example, Baimak protest that was in January 24, which started, it was not anti-war per se, and it was really important for local activists that we, when we discuss this topic and engage in discussion of this topic, wouldn't call this movement separatist or anti-war, something like that. That was ecological movement. It was the movement for local activists, and people were really moved to do something, to go out. And of course, anti-war movement, anti-Putin census were still in the heart of this process, were still in the heart of this people going out. We also see the very interesting movement of women who want their men back. And I think when we talk about the things, it is really important to say that sometimes people should engage in protest on their terms. Of course, if I will read you some sentiments that are in this women's group, they do not think about high matters, they just want their men back. but it's still a movement, that is still a protest, and it is still an anti-war thought. And I think like the last thing that we saw openly, that we can saw openly, and that was supported by local activists in Russia, was the flash mob on the 28th of September. That was for abortion rights for women. And many people took part in this flash mob, not only in Russia, but also people who left, who have platform, who can speak up freely. But there were also women and local activists, local feminists, who decided to push the hotline for women who want to have safe abortions, who made a wonderful foundation where they gathered like special medicine for women who want to participate in this abortion. And sometimes when I talk about these things, it's not always clear, like women's rights and war, what do they have in common? Everything. Like the answer is everything, and I think everyone in this room understands it. So the resistance is not always, I am going out and I'm saying that I'm anti-Putin, I'm anti-war. Sometimes it is, I'm pro-women's rights, I'm pro-Fail Alsynov, I'm like, I don't know, I want to be quadrober, apparently, according to what Putin says. So, yes, I think our focus should be on understanding that resistance is a spectrum and trying to be ready to support different forms of resistance and be ready to help people on their terms and help local activists on the matters that are important for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luba. Now I'm turning to our sociologist panel. Just to put it briefly, I think I would ask you two of my questions. First, I want us to take a little step back and talk about the general public. And I'm sure that you've been asked this question a lot, but I cannot avoid it. We all know that there's a lot of skepticism against the opinion polls that are being conducted in Russia for obvious reasons. But still, which data do you rely on in your research? And what is your assessment of public sentiment now in 2024 on the third year of the war? How would you describe it? And my second question would be about this silent protest that you started to talk about. Could you please break down this a little for us?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to point out the importance of what Luba said about the forms of protest. Once again, when I talked about community building, it's mostly what is presented now in many aspects, and this is invisible. It's less mediatized, but it doesn't want to be mediatized. And so one of the methodological questions for sociologists is just like how to grasp it, and also for journalists how to translate it to others, right? Through the borderline of silence and fear. And it's true that fear is silent, and operating public opinion under pressure, under censorship, and in the space of fear is quite a tricky operation. So I'd like to recall a point which is not sociological and which comes from the conceptual art. And Ilya Kabakov, once in the Soviet Union, drew this graph of hope and fear, which is quite a piece of conceptual art in itself, but it's also interesting. It's very subjective, and in the same time, he kind of generalized his experience, his collective experience, the generational experience, and what he did, it's a kind of working with concepts and translating them in non-verbal form, not directly verbal form, because as in Soviet Union, as today in Russia, the verbal form is under censorship, right? So one of the ways to work with that, if you may pass to the next slide, was this kind of working with conceptual material. I was gathering drawings of society, but it was possible when I was in Russia, now I'm out of Russia. It's still possible. I still gather some drawings, and I revisit the drawings which were gathered previously, and I should say that the interpretation of the concepts behind changed very much, because previously they were looking more protest ones. Today they are looking like made by people who were much more foresighting as compared to what we thought in 2012 about the possible evolution of the situation, right? And from this point of view, the question is like, the fear operates in silence. The community building is also not revealing itself in full pledge just because it's unsafe. And so what should we trust more as data? And one of the tricks which is possible in this situation is not to target only those who receive some events, some experiences, and then put it under silence, but especially to see what is told, what is said by those who speak publicly, who still speak publicly. And in many cases, those who I mentioned are people producing culture in their working places, like teachers, like journalists, like artists, and other cultural professions. And from this point of view, it's interesting to play with Kabakov's idea and to see how liberal media today in Russia operate with key concepts, like, for example, fear, protest, joy, hope, and shame. These are the concepts which were in the focus of intellectual and public discussions from the beginning of war, and it's really important to see it in the perspective, in the context. And from that point of view, I would say that you see quite an important kind of effervescence, quite an important vitalization of conceptual emotional language in liberal media, which are still, those are only media selected, which are still operating in Russia, in Russian territory. And you see that with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, all the emotional vocabulary is going down, not only the one of hope and the one of joy, but also the one of fear, which is quite important in terms of censorship, right? So even the ex-liberal, ex-liberal media in operating in Russian territory kind of lowering down the emotional language. But I should put it in context. You see here 4 different media excerpts of the same period, and you see that the so-called yellow press, which is, for example, Komsomolskaya Pravda or Argumenты и Fakты, which are not really propaganda ones. But still you see that after 2017, they also lower down the emotional language. They do not call the concepts by their names, right? Instead, in the liberal press and all liberal media mixed, it's the contrary. It's like just an explosion of emotional language, of the language of protest, of fear, of hope, etc. And we see how the propaganda operates indirectly, just with the evacuation of concepts from the public circulation, and the liberal media which try to compensate it, even under pressure. And the regional media and media in general, you see that there is no huge change in the emotional vocabulary. The fear and the hope are more or less on the same level, but still there is a slight going up in the federal, in the central media, which means that the propaganda boosts the emotional language, also of hope, of pride, so the positive values, emotional values connected to the war. You see here that one forms of what we may call resistance, without calling it protest, the professional ones, is speaking about things which are not really desirable for the government. And you see that, for example, the yellow press speaks less and less about power, about income, and about inflation, and even about God. more or less the same picture is in the media of the relocated liberal media, which quit the Russian territory starting from 2014. But what is really interesting that Russian media, which started as liberal ones, which were censored, which boards were changed, etc., still speak about more or less the same values like power, income, and the third one is not God, but the inflation. And I wouldn't call this resistance in strict form of this word, but still we know that there is a prescription coming this year from the administration of President to stop discussing inflation and growing prices and everything of this. So we will see the results in the final graph for 2024. But still you see that the major topics, power, income and God, are not discussed in liberal Russian media as they are discussed even in the relocated ones. No way to... And this is just another illustration of how it works. So you see, it's also the media which cites different names. Thank you. The yellow press and the relocated liberal media is more or less similar, more or less homologous in the way they cite through years 3 or 4 main figures like Gorbachev, Lenin, Nicholas II, and Stalin. As you see here, Stalin is not the top figure. And for example, for the anniversary of the October Revolution, Lenin was neither. It was Nicholas II in both, in all the Russian-speaking media. But it's really impressive. The liberal press, the liberal media which are operating in Russia speak mostly about Lenin today. In 2022, they were mentioning Lenin much more frequently than the relocated liberal media and the yellow press in Russia. You could say it's a kind of argument, an artifact, etc. They're not huge numbers. You see, it's just like less than 1% of the whole of the total number of publications which mention these names. But what is important, one of the historical work, or the work with the historical memory, which is going on in the liberal media remaining in Russia, is analyzing more and more the Soviet experience, speaking more about repressions, speaking more about the construction of political order, especially in some supplements and auxiliary materials, which are not connected directly to the current wire of news. And I would say that this all shows to us that even in journalism, which is under high pressure, even if protest or dissent or other forms of disconsensus are not allowed speaking properly in the public space, there are forms of particular attention, of testing some topics, of speaking about inflation and about Lenin more frequently than in popular press or yellow press, which remains a form of accumulation of the resource of resistance, of cultural resistance, where under the dictatorship pressure, the culture becomes the resource of resistance itself.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. This is really interesting insights. I think we're running a little bit out of time, and I want to ask my last question before we turn to our audience, to all of our panelists. Do you think that there is enough of what has been done to support people who oppose the current regime in Russia? And what can be done if there's something? And who can actually support Russian citizens who are currently opposing the war, the regime? What are your takes on that? Who wants to start?
If I may, this is a wonderful question, and thank you so much. I just wanted to reiterate what Alexandra just said, like resistance comes in different forms. Sometimes it's learning your native language, sometimes it's a support group for political prisoners, sometimes it's feminist or queer reading. So all these activities, they require resources, and I'm not talking financial resources, I'm talking about moral resources and psychological resources. And to help others, you have to help yourself first. And I want to take the advice of Frank Vichorka and first say thank you to all of us and to reiterate how much have been done through these years. And I think I was very pessimistic in the beginning, but the level of nets that we were able to build in very harsh circumstances, the amount of grassroots organizations that saw the problem and went there and tried to fix it themselves, the conferences, the discussions, the financial help. I was so amazed when a lot of media figures not only educated themselves really quickly on trans issues, which is not like even seen in, I don't know, in USA sometimes when people have time and have resources to think. Now in harsh conditions we had to educate ourselves on trans issues and also gather a lot of money in very short time. I think till 3rd of September we had like, I don't know, a month when we could have done that. How much decolonial organizations have done, not only to elevate this topic in the media, but also to say like decoloniality is not always separatism, it's different topics, it's sometimes learning your local language, it's sometimes just understanding that, I don't know, xenophobia is bad, something like that was done in such harsh circumstances and with amazing repressions from the government. That's why I think it is very important for us to focus on first maintaining what we have built, continuing our support to Ukraine, because we are here and we are more free to do so, and we have been doing a lot since the beginning. So I think like focusing on what we can do with those resources that we have available is really important. But also at the same time focus on how we can help people in Russia maintain the form of protest that is available to them. That means not only psychological support, sometimes physical support, but also engaging people in communication, in discussions safely, but also not excluding them, because sometimes from fearing that this might be risky, we tend to exclude Russian voices from people in Russia, indigenous, ethnic, regional voices from the discussion. And this is really valuable, this is really important. And some access stuff. So, for example, I know many initiatives were focused on giving free VPN to people. Now they are running out. For example, I know that Center T gave a lot of VPN access, and it would be run out, I think, by the end of this month. And creating these spaces for feminist reading, queer readings, and supporting making online places, of course, seeing everyone is so valuable and so great, but sometimes we could also make online presentations where we cannot see faces. That is sad, but sometimes it is safe for people who can join only on these terms. And I think a lot has done in these regards as well. And material and financial support is also, of course, important. And also, I think we have to find ways to do this very safely. And this means that we have to sacrifice transparency, unfortunately. But this is the reality that we live in.
Thank you, Luba. Yeah, Mikhail, you wanted to...
Yeah, let me frame my answer to your question with another question. Why are these people doing this? And then how can we help them? So I once had the chance to speak to somebody who runs around in Moscow and sprays graffitis. And he wouldn't spray, he explained to me, he wouldn't do that in the most visible places, because as soon as you spray something on the Kremlin's walls, the next second somebody would wipe it away. So he does it under bridges or in some passageways where you would detect it only after a while, but enough people would have seen it. So, and I asked him, so why are you doing this, given all the risk? And he said, well, this is a signal. I know I won't bring down the regime with a graffiti. I won't change society. But I want us to be visible. I would like to tell others that I am here, that we are still here. And this is what I think this is about visibility. So now the question is, how can we help to enlarge visibility? And I think this is actually by, as soon as something like that appears on social media, to retweet and then, you know, from the outside, bring it back in via social media, so that as much as possible people see that there are people who are against, and make them visible. I think this visibility is very important for the protest, and also to work against what the regime tries, this demoralization, complete demoralization, that nothing makes sense. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you so much. I guess we can now turn to the audience. Yeah. So yeah, I see there are already quite a few hands.
Thank you very much, Dmitry Dubrovsky, Charles University, Prague. If I understood you correctly, so probably my question goes to Luba. Do you see any kind of tension? Because I also in my work, I'm trying to breach the Russian academics with those academics who are in exile. Do you see their kind of tension? Because one part of the community, they look voiceless, or they have been oppressed because of their risk, because of their ideological and political repression, while the another part of the community, they try to speak. And that is the tension. I can see it, at least I'm feeling. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's a question to you. Do you see the tension between this part of the community who are, you know, in Russia, and those who defected the country? Because, well, I'm currently collecting the numerous responses in the way you have no right to speak on behalf of us, because you are not suffering as we, and even more, some people even accuse those who defect the country. You are collecting the benefits while we are collecting the suffering and pain. So that is let me focus on this, because that is very important, because we still need to have these people involved. And this is for us, for the community building, it's very important, and I would love to know what would be your recommendation in this, or your response in this case. Thank you.
I think we should gather some more questions, and then, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm Ivan Fomin, Ideas for Russia. My question is, first, short question to Alexandra about the differences in the numbers of flower protests in different cities. Do you have any good hypothesis how to explain these differences in the number of in the number of flower memorials in different cities? And the longer question to everybody is, so overall in this panel, we kind of start with protests and we go to resistance and community building as one of the forms of resistance. How about if we reframe the question and we start with the community building? What's going on in Russia? Is the society becoming more atomized and disconnected, or it's becoming more connected? Maybe it's kind of uncivil society or illiberal forms of communities, this kind of stuff. What's your impression, insight? Thank you.
Thank you. And
Yes, I have a question and a short comment. When the question is to Alexander, the sociologist, I have a feeling then that sociology in authoritarian state and totalitarian, moving fast to totalitarian, is not about numbers. It's about a narrative that needs to be explained actually not in the country but outside the country. It has to be explained to the world why the statistics of 89% of people supporting the war against Ukraine are such, and whether they could be relied upon. So my question is about sociology. What is the narrative of sociology at the moment that you and your colleagues should be projecting to the world to explain Russia and the reactions and to defy propaganda inside the country? And my comment is about, your question was what needs to be done. to support the brave voices of civil society. Three things I think we should all do outside Russia. One, it's we need to talk to the multinationals. We need to talk to Apple and Google and actually explain to them that by taking the VPNs away from figures like political prisoners, like others, Yashin was talking about as well, figures like Yashin Pivovarov, these VPNs are the only way to actually reach the Russian people. So business considerations could not be leading. And they were the first to actually strip, I'm not a technological person, but to strip this, because there was no function to make money, they stripped it from Russians. And that was a support to bloggers, to independent media people. We need to reach them. Because the governments we could talk to, but the multinationals are unreachable entities that make their own business decisions. Two, we need to talk to our governments about, in Europe and elsewhere, about the visas for Russian human rights defenders. The ones continuing to work in the country, they have to have prolonged visas, not just for 3 days to visit the Nemtsov Forum, if at all. They have to have mobility to come and talk to us from the inside Russia, but also the way at the moment many countries are stripping Russian citizens at large, holders of Russian passports, from tourist visa, from any access to their countries. There should be exception for human rights defenders, for anti-war activists, for the dissidents, and this is the conversation we need to have with our governments. And keeping persecuted Russian activists who cannot go back to the country up to 3 years awaiting asylum interviews. This is unacceptable. So these are not very popular and not very politically correct conversations, and I think Russian activists cannot have them with their governments, but we need to help them. Because this whole Russophobic blanket approach by some governments to all Russians cannot come now shopping in our countries. Well, how about Kara-Murza? How he could have come to Oslo to have a speech there against the war against Ukraine, for which he received 25 years imprisonment, if you now stripped all Russian passport holders from tourist visas? There should be absolutely an exception. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there's a last row. Yeah.
Я буду на русском. Скажу, что очень большое спасибо за социологию, которую вы показали. Это очень резонирует. В нашей команде мы проводили некий анализ и просчитывали очень интересную такую концепцию, что если сейчас в России произошел бы мирный протест в 27 регионах, в каждом из которых вышло бы от 15 до 30 тысяч людей, война в Украине бы прекратилась, потому что ментов, которые могут охватить такое количество, просто в России нет. То есть физически полицейских бы не хватило для того, чтобы локализировать такой протест. И, соответственно, простым решением нужно было бы работать с тем, чтобы как-то армию переключить на подавление такого протеста. Поэтому я в своей концепции работы очень стараюсь строить ее на социологических данных. И я думаю, что самое такое точное, что вы здесь сказали, это про страх и потенциальную активность, которую проявляет гражданское общество внутри России. Мы видим, что оно огромно, но, к сожалению, не хватает вот этой скоординированности сетей, которые есть внутри, с теми элитами, которые есть вовне, это во-первых, и между собой внутри. Потому что диктаторский режим очень много работает над тем, чтобы разорвать слабые связи и не допустить любой координации. Особенно между представителями гражданского общества, между разными субъектами федерации. И мой поинт и комментарий, он о том, что если работать над тремя тремя простыми, на самом-то деле, точками. Если будут федеральные движения, которые говорят о том, что можно сделать внутри России и предлагают какие-то варианты развития будущего. Если есть региональные активисты и local communities, об этом могу очень много сказать, но не буду. Local communities, которые устойчивы и могут действовать на местах и выполнять две функции – координацию и мобилизацию населения. И есть в национальных республиках элиты, которые готовы договариваться, трансформация в Россию будущего может произойти очень быстро, намного быстрее, чем мы думаем. Вот такой вот комментарий. Спасибо.
Спасибо. I think, yeah, that was our last comment. Luba, there was a question for you and about the tension,
Yes.
yeah, between those who remain and between those who left. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question about the tension. I think sometimes the feeling of injustice is justified, so to say, because we see a lot of narratives that people should stop the war, people should stop fighting in Russia. But on the other hand, for example, Germany, who said that Germany will do a lot to help people who decided to desert the army, like the amount of acceptance of these visas from the people who deserted is not so high. That's why sometimes I think it is valid that people feel injustice. Or we say that people should go protest, but for example, like colleagues from Zona Solidarnosti then can validate the fight to say that not all peaceful acts of protest should be, like all these people should still be supported, all the political prisoners should be supported. It was a fight that was like, that was an everyday mundane job from people who are for human rights. So I think sometimes this tension could be, and this is inevitable. On the other hand, I think it is vital that we as people who left are not speaking for, but trying to create places where people could speak up themselves safely. For example, we had very, like I think, very good action where we proposed queer people in Russia to say what they want to say in Pride, for example, in different countries, because I can go to Pride very safely and like policemen will say hi to me, they wouldn't beat me up, which is not the case in Turkey, where like I ran from police, or in Russia, where it is unimaginable currently. So we received, I think, 200 voices, and we draw them on posters and went out to Pride. This is a small act, but it shows to people who are in Russia that we are here for you, not speaking like on your behalf, but actually saying what you want to say. Any sort of thing you want to say. For example, there was like Masha, 99% Masha, 99% lesbian, 1% Masha. And like people went to the Pride with this poster, which is wonderful, I think. That's why I think being mindful of these discrepancies, being mindful that if we have a Zoom meeting, we should do it safely. We shouldn't do it in Zoom. We should do it in Jitsi, for example. These small actions are there to help get rid of this tension, which is there, which should be there. Because I don't think that protest or resistance should be without tension, should be without conflict. Conflict and disagreement is a vital form of resistance as well, but we should work towards working together.
Thank you, Luba. There was this question, I guess, to anyone who wants to take it, from Ivan Fomin about whether people in Russia are atomizing more or it's the other way around. I guess.
Yes, it was also about communities, and Ivan proposed to see it from the reverse perspective as opposed to normally media perspective, right? So communities are invisible, so how can we touch the ground of the communication and of communitarian life in Russia? I would say there are small opportunities for analysis, for more or less large-scale analysis. But what is quite crucial, at least in interviews and conversations, I still continue at distance, is the fact that even inside communities, persons, people prefer not to speak out loudly. So this is quite an important effect of the self-censorship, so that it's kind of cautious attitude even to the closest persons, even to those with whom you seemingly share some political or more larger public civic attitude, and this speaks about the destruction of the community life. And what Luba mentioned is especially important, this through the border work, where the diaspora or just people who left try to support the communication, not only, not precisely the protest action, but just communication, which is essential. On the other side, it's true that alimented with money, there are communities on the side of the uncivil society, and Zeit bloggers and poets of the right wing and some other communities are growing because they now have spaces, they have places to gather in, they are supported financially, and this is an important point for all of us who are thinking about how to help the resistance in Russia. First of all, the community is the primary value. So it's not just like small acts of resistance, because normally when they are anonymized, you don't see the community behind it. But what is essential, they are normally communities who commit, for example, the systematic tagging of walls in the cities, or creating memorials to the children of Mariupol, etc., etc. So which means that the Soviet formula of supporting the activism was maybe better than the today's one, because the today's one is based on project. So the communities need today to translate the requirements in project-based curricula and to ask the finance for project. Meanwhile, in the Soviet time, there were no kind of caritative associations or funds who were financing projects or the communities of resistance, but still the popular way of diplomacy was, for example, bringing books by person in the plane to those who really need books. And that was to element the community. And I would say that if we really think about the global lines of supporting Russian activism in Russia, it's more about supporting community and communal life and communication. And this might be made, and it was always made through culture. So to think how the culture connects with community building, for example, feminist reading groups, this is an essential way of constructing the feminist community. Some other forms of specific cultural values for the communities, this is really the point of reflection.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexandra. Mikhail, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just two thoughts on this community building. I think obviously social media is one way of community building, but we have to take into account that people are extremely distrustful about who is in the chat and who shouldn't be actually in the chat. So. And also people are very concerned about what remains in the chat. This is why many people then clean their chats afterwards immediately, which is utterly important. But I realized actually that a very good old style, the personal encounter and private meetings are very important. And I've been to many of those. They can be outside of Moscow at the dacha or in some private flats. That, you know, meeting with people you trust and you can trust, that is very important. I think this is what is maintained and what is actually now growing more and more, that people meet again, obviously much more than during COVID times, but that they use the opportunity to meet up in private with people they can trust. There was also one point raised, the question of support of the war, and of course, if you read all these statistics, and even those, not the official ones, but the statistics, the more reliable by Levada, that such an overwhelming majority supports the war, the regime, and so on, I think it's very important to note that this majority is, that there's no enthusiasm about all of that, that it's rather a fatalistic approach to we cannot do anything else, there's no other way. And of course, this mood which quells and demoralizes protests and opposition of any kind, that there is this seeming majority, is based on one very important factor the regime works with, and this is this idea of stability and normalcy. And I think if there was, doctrines in Russia in the 20th century, like the doctrine of permanent revolution, permanent mobilization under Stalin, now it's permanent stabilization, which is so utterly important for Putin. And it is not clear to me yet what could possibly undermine this. And this is then when all these communities which have been built will be so important. Inflation has been mentioned, and I think inflation at this point, because they can't really control it, and it's just the other side of the coin of military buildup and high wages in the military industry. So this is something which can get out of control, but I wouldn't say we are not there yet, and I can't foresee what elements will be to undermine the stability. But as soon as stability seems to be endangered, I think then all these communities will be very important, and this is why it's so important to keep them in the back, to keep them and develop them even under these very difficult circumstances.
Thank you so much. And Alexandra, last remarks.
Yes, I had a very very specific question about how I could explain the difference in numbers of these flowers, spontaneous shrines. As you saw in my pictures, so there is cities where there are a lot of spontaneous shrines every time. It's of course it's Moscow, St. Petersburg, but also it's Novosibirsk, Ekaterinburg, Cheboksary. Oh, I don't have a good answer for you, but it's always like that. So maybe because Novosibirsk and Ekaterinburg they have a huge like resistance potential. Maybe and highly possible. That's why it happens, because they already had a long tradition of local protest. Also, it's a big cities with a university, so there is a high number of young people. But Novosibirsk and Ekaterinburg are the biggest, the most protesting cities in Russia, except for Moscow, St. Petersburg. And the number of repression is a little bit less in Siberia and Ural. It's also important. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for this very, very important conversation and for your valuable insights. Thank you so much.